afternoon, friends. Welcome to the STP training webinar, which is the art and science of test automation. Our speaker for the day is Mandana Habizadeh. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester myself, and I'm excited to host you all and Mandana on our STP webinars. A very warm welcome, Mandana. We are very thrilled to have you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Mandana Habizadeh is a principal test automation engineer at Discount Tire Company. She received her Master of Science in Information Systems with concentration on database systems from Lawrence Technological University in Michigan. She has been working in test automation and development for past 14 years. I was about to say 24. Mandana has worked on multiple automation initiatives and is passionate about building powerful automated test suites. She believes in evaluating new solutions for various challenges we face in the automation field that could improve the quality of the delivered product. In her free time, she enjoys learning new languages, reading, music, hiking, swimming, and spending time with her family. So let me transfer the control to you now. Mandana, a very warm welcome again, and the floor is all yours now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Smita. I'm thrilled to be presenting at Software Test Professional webinar series. I wanted to take a few minutes and thank our webinar organizers for creating and supporting such a strong learning community. I think in our ever-changing field, staying connected together and sharing knowledge is very critical. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the art and science of test automation. Just to give you a little background on why I decided to give this talk, I've been a practitioner in the field of automation and development for over 14 years. During this time, I've seen the industry go through massive transformations in a relatively short period of time, which makes it logical to change rapidly when your industry changes. But what I've also observed is that companies that are most successful during these transformations look at change very systematically. They have the ability to step back and reevaluate their approach after they quickly shift and change, which I think gives extremely invaluable insight and opportunity for growth and improvement. This will help you align your efforts basically with the intention and objective of your program that you're trying to improve, in this case, test automation program. Just a quick note before we get started. During this talk today, I'll be focusing on test automation. I've seen many use the term automation and test automation interchangeably. This is not my intention. Although I believe that automation is also an essential part of supporting testing, it is very different from test automation. And for the sake of time during this talk today, I'll mainly focus on test automation. So why test automation? So the talk today is divided into two parts: the science of test automation, which focuses on framework and technology, and the art of test automation, which focuses on creating and finding out the true value of automation for you and your company, and the fact that these two are inseparable. So why test automation? I know these questions might sound cliche, but I highly recommend taking the time and answering them. Answering these questions will help you focus on the true value of automation for you and your company. If I were to compare this slide with productivity, the question would be, do you want to be more productive? And the answer is invariably yes. Everybody wants to be more productive, but not everyone will become more productive. And I think what most people fail to do is to clarify the intent. Why is it that you want to be more productive? And the answer to that question will become your mission statement and will keep you engaged and help you follow that right objective. Similarly, the answer to why test automation will be unique for you and your company, but it helps you clarify the driving factors. So I highly recommend taking the time and contemplating that particular objective for you and your company. This will help you later on quantify and measure your success and your progress. So the second question, do you automate your test entirely using UI, drives the answer to the third question. If your second question, response to the second question is yes, your third question is most probably a yes. And the reason being is that you really shouldn't, and you won't be able to do all of your testing through UI. Many companies that I've seen with successful automation programs focus on not only functional UI tests, but also they focus on API integration and automated visual tests, unit tests. So they have a variety of tools to support their test automation activities. And here, as you can see in this slide, which is based on the research from QA Symphony and TechWell survey of 2018, there are different kinds of automated tests done by different teams, and the research was done basically surveying 173 testers in 2018. As you can see, there are so many different kinds of testing, automated testing that different teams are doing now. Unit test, API, UI, the rest of them might be visual testing and other kinds of testing. But what I wanted to focus on here on this slide is the variety of testing that's being done and the percentage. And the more we focus on or basically balancing these type of testing, the better the chances of success for your automation program. And I've seen the most common answers to the questions that we saw in the previous slide would be, we no longer want to, for instance, just test our software, but we want to test them rapidly. We want to run more tests on different platforms or platforms that are more important to our end users. Or we would like to find problems early on in our development lifecycle. Or one of my favorite answers is that we not only want to run our tests, but we would like to free our time to do more exploratory testing. I think more exploratory testing are highly analytical. They're very valuable. It gives you time to spend basically with the application on their test, and they're very effective for testing new applications. So these are some of the values that I've seen companies think test automation brings for them. So if I were to start a science project or a scientific research, I would start with a hypothesis and then an accompanying research question and a framework to analyze that particular and test that particular hypothesis. Similarly, when it comes to automated testing, once you recognize that you have particular needs for test automation, you will need to determine the key factor in your test automation program. For instance, you need to create a mechanism to hook into and drive your application under test. You then need to be able to execute all of these tests and report on the result of these tests. This is where a framework will help you achieve these objectives. Whether you're using an existing framework or you're creating one from scratch, that framework will give you the ability to create tests and to scale without thinking about the complexities and the underlying tools, basically with every single test that you write. You can decide, for instance, as part of your framework, what design pattern you want to use. If you would like to use a page object model that helps you reduce the duplication of code, and reduce the impact of the UI change. So the framework is very helpful in giving you the ability to modularize and write reusable tests that's easy to maintain. And there are certain criteria that you need to follow in order to pick your framework. So the factors that are important, obviously, are the type of application under test. Let's say that you're thinking about working on an Android application. You might want to decide what framework to use based on the platform that particular mobile application is on. Let's say an Android application that your company is deciding to build. You might think about having a framework that supports that in particular, for instance, Espresso framework, or if you think that ultimately your company is going to go to an iOS app, you might think about the framework that supports both iOS and Android app. Such as Appium, for instance. So you also need to think about the programming language that you will be using in your framework. I've seen many people argue that the best programming language to use as part of your framework is the language that your developers use. This could be true depending on your landscape, but I think it's mostly dependent on who will be maintaining that framework, especially since your framework might be supporting multiple applications that your company has, and those applications will be written in different programming languages. So I think one of the main things to think about when you think about that language would be what language are you and your team most productive in? A few other things that I think it's really important to think about when you think about your framework selection is your framework should be application independent. Again, your particular framework will be supporting or might be supporting different automation efforts. You should be able to easily scale and write more tests, and your framework should be flexible enough to give you the ability to integrate other solutions that you're not thinking about at the time of your framework selection. And I'll give you some example. In other words, your framework shouldn't be limiting. So here I created a sample framework as part of prepping for this webinar. As you can see, this is a BDD framework with Cucumber, Selenium WebDriver, and Java language binding. I must say I was extremely pleased and impressed with the choice of unique IDs on Software Test Professional website. And as you can see in this BDD framework, I'm using a feature file, which basically has an English-like language. I use Gherkin. And this is, in particular, very helpful because it helps you communicate and collaborate with different teams that you're working with, whether you're working in a completely agile environment or any other methodology that you use. This will help you bridge the gap between your QAs, your developers, and your SMEs, basically, or your business analysts. As you can see, under resources, I've broken down the application into logical pieces per page. So this is following the page object model. I have a about page, a home page, items page, subscribe, training, and all the pages that I could go to and navigate from the home page of STPCon. I also created a driver, and I'm just using Chrome driver here, but obviously you can use any different kind of driver that you would like to test in. In the next slide, we can see the step definition, or basically the glue, which will help you have your code basically call your methods that are in your Java classes. I did not separate the before and after. I mean, you can definitely go further and take the before and after and take them into a separate class, basically. But like I said, this is just a quick project that I created as part of demonstrating that BDD framework. So your step definition class will have calls to your Java classes, whether you're navigating or asserting or doing whatever in your other Java classes, you will call them in your step definition classes. And we talked about the framework not being limiting. In other words, you want to make sure that you're able to integrate solutions that you want later on in your project that you think about, that you didn't think about at the time of creating your framework. For instance, if I were to integrate visual testing, let's say if I were to use Appium, I'd be able to easily integrate and have the dependencies in my pom.xml and write visual testing for that particular application. So what about the rest of the automation? Basically, we have a great framework now, it's in place, it supports your testing, and as we know, it's an essential part of an automation program. There's another piece to automation that it's unfortunately easily overlooked, and it's another crucial part of your automation effort. Your automation is profoundly affected by the test selection for and your testing practices in general. If you're automating tests without thinking about modeling practices or deconstructing your application, pretty soon you'll find a project or a framework that's filled with different kinds of tests that are not really logical. So testing basically is based on model. How you create your test is based on your understanding of that product or the model of that product in your mind. So it's really important for testers to brainstorm, analyze, and review their assumptions with their peers, with the SMEs and other developers. And the problem with bad tests would be it's not very easy to detect them quickly. So code reviews are great, and they can improve your coding practices, but they rarely focus on the value of the test. So I think it's really important to pay attention to the value of the test that you're adding to your automation suites. In short, it doesn't really matter how robust your framework is if you're using that particular framework and writing low-value tests. And so if you focus on the fundamentals, how you practice testing basically in your organizations, how you go about training your team in writing valuable tests, I think that will impact, that has a crucial impact in your automation program as well. So testing is about observing and analyzing. And if you look at this example that I have here, on the left side, you can easily see this is an abstract painting of someone who knew how to draw. And on the right side, as you can see, these are good colors, but you can tell that this was done by someone who didn't really pay attention or didn't know drawing much. So there are so many indicators that can help you identify and recognize poorly written tests. Things that you can watch for instance, are tests that are unclear and they have non-deterministic result, and they don't have really a clear prerequisite. Steps that you see are too generic and vague, that usually signals that you don't really know what the test should do. And I think at the beginning of writing tests, it's okay if you don't know and you have certain assumptions, but you need to keep in mind to clarify those assumptions and basically discuss it and get to a point where you have more deterministic tests in your suite. Tests that don't have specific data, for instance, and they have unclear test or expected results. You know, as we have in a science experiment, the focus should be on clarity, control, and outlining your assumption. The same is true and should be exercised with in testing, for instance. If you don't have controlled environment, if you don't have controlled data, your test results are not going to be very dependable and reliable. And your assumptions should be clearly communicated at the beginning of the test. Otherwise, once you scale, it'll be very easy to understand why you wrote the test and to evaluate those tests when you have a huge test bed or number of tests, basically. So learning to draw, or basically focusing on the fundamental, would be challenge of any successful automation program or testing program in general. I think the ability to direct your team to focus on the right deterministic test and to train them and get to a point that you repeat this process enough so you have the right velocity, because at the same time you don't want to have you don't want to get into analysis paralysis where we are analyzing things too much that we can't really create our tests in a timely manner. I think that's really important. So applying the same concept and principle of dry to your test case creation, don't repeat yourself, just reviewing your test constantly to make sure that you're not creating duplicate, whether this goes to your creation of method or actual creation of test. I think it is a very valuable exercise. It might seem that you're slowing down at the beginning, but once you practice this enough, you'll get very good at it, and it will help you in the long run to create valuable tests. Also look at clear, objective, or basically atomic tests. So each test that you add should have a clear objective. Your assertions should be clear and to the point and for one particular reason. Use test case design techniques. I think these are valuable practices that unfortunately has been forgotten as we focus more and more on the technology side. We are not spending enough time to create tests based on particular design technique and basically training our team to follow that particular technique. So just as a skilled artist can tell the difference between the work of art that was produced by someone who knew drawing or just painting, by looking at an automation program, you would be able to tell if that program was designed with a clear, defined mission and objective, or just by a need of, I need to introduce automation just because other companies are doing automation. I think the other thing that is really important to focus on is your objective. So based on the answer to the question that we had above and the mission statement that your particular automation program has, it's really important to focus on that mission statement and report on that. I'd say don't focus on the number of tests that you automate, but rather the value of automation that you're adding. Let's say that your mission statement is to shorten your test cycles, then make sure you track and you measure that test cycle, and then as you add more test suites and run your test in an automated way, track and see how you're helping achieve that particular goal. Constantly review your suite and train your testers to focus on the value of the test. Let's say that your mission is to have fewer defects. Track those defects when they appear, and then have your testers look at the defects that were not found during or earlier in the life cycle, and focus on the ones that the team has found in UAT, for instance, and add those tests to your test suite. And so your test suites are living artifacts. You need to constantly look at them and adjust if there are tests in there that you keep running and they keep failing. If you won't be able to fix tests, if whether you have defects that you're not planning on fixing, or there are data issues that are causing failures, discuss and try to resolve and remove and if you're not planning to resolve, then discuss with the team that you shouldn't really be running those tests if there's no plan on fixing them, and add the high impact tests. And one of the references in the lessons learned book from software testing was avoid the old oak tree syndrome, which I found very interesting. And I'm sure many of us have seen those test cases or test suite that have certain number of tests that we always run and we always report on, but we haven't really looked at in a long period of time. That particular test suite might have been written when the application was new, and there are tests in that particular application that we may no longer need. So revisit those tests, run them again, review them with your QAs and your developers, and understand if there is true value in having those tests, or if you'd like to remove them. So automation objective mostly is to save time and to speed up development and increase your test coverage. Automation should help you become more productive in your testing. If you're focusing on wrong test, or if you're not focusing on the true value of the test, or just fixing or maintaining your tests because they are in your test suite, they can distract you and waste your time and resources. And finally, make sure that you quantify and you measure your success. Again, at the beginning of the slides, we had that slide where we specified our true objective and mission. Find out what those particular objective and goals are for you and your particular automation program, and then track them. As you can see, again, this slide is based on the 2018 QA Symphony and TechWell survey. Many companies are measuring their success based on test coverage. This will help you if you have a clear understanding of your complete test repository. So if you have an application that you know exactly what and the number of tests that is going to cover that application, this is a great way for automation to be measured and to automate your test coverage, basically. And then if you want to make sure that the number of builds that are being measured, then you can specify it as your mission statement. Requirement coverage, I'm not quite sure. I mean, there are not very clear requirements, in my opinion, as we are trying to develop faster and learn the application as we go and improve the application. But as you can see, there are companies that measure their success based on that requirement coverage through automated testing. Defect density, I was surprised to see this at 17%. I thought that might be higher, but this is basically from researching 173 testers and developers that have been using automation and reporting in their success. So here are some light reading. These are some of the books that I found very interesting in testing in particular, whether it's in testing, whether it's specifically for automation. And there's one in particular for systems, the thinking in systems, which I found very interesting as well. And here's my contact information. Thank you so much for joining in this webinar. I hope that the talk has given you some information that you can apply to your automation effort. And with that, I would like to pass the presentation back to Smita or open it up for any questions that anyone might have.
Hey, thank you, Mandana. Yeah. So yes, we do have questions. We're going to start with the questions that we have been submitted so far. And if others have questions, please start sharing them quickly. Okay. So the first question is, are you aware of any custom or commercial test frameworks that can test multiple interfaces? For example, creating a record using an API, then modifying it using the mobile app and desktop browser.
Okay. So for one framework to support all of this, I haven't seen, or I don't know any particular framework, but I must say the framework that we use at my company, which is basically one that has been written, or it's a custom framework. We use it for mobile testing. We use it for web application testing. We do use a commercial product for our desktop testing. So I don't know of any particular framework that supports all of different automated testing for different applications or desktop and mobile that was mentioned.
Thank you. The next question is, I want to know a good app where we can start using for automation testing. I know that can vary based on projects, but just one that gives the base to start looking for one good app. So I've asked the attendee if it's a good app or a good tool they're asking for. But hypothetically, it's let's go with the term app. Is there some app that we could try testing on, like start using our automation knowledge?
I'm not sure about a good app. Like you said, I would think this might be more like an automation framework. There are so many out of the box or existing automation framework that you can just Google, and like I said, depending on your landscape, if your testers are going to write automation or developers, then there are different kind of frameworks that you can go with. But I'd say what I've seen in most companies is that there is a need to be able to bridge the gap between technical and non-technical members of your team, whether you're talking about SMEs or your business analyst or your QAs, if they are not technical QAs, and your automation engineers. And I'd say something like a BDD would be a great way to introduce automation. And if you have technical developers or automation engineers and all the testing is done by your technical team, then you can certainly just go with another solution, Selenium WebDriver and Java, and then having a good reporting solution would help you basically automate faster.
Yep, thank you. So there is another question here. Okay, it's not really about automation per se, but related. What are your opinions on outsourcing automation efforts?
So outsourcing automation, it really depends on your landscape again. If you don't have it, I mean, automation is no longer an option. It is a necessity. If you have resources that can help you automate, perfect, you're one of the lucky ones. If you don't have enough and you really need to speed up and automate, you have to outsource. But I think it's very important to keep in mind how you're going to maintain and do knowledge transfer once you're done with that particular effort. So the challenge would be bringing your team members up to speed with the framework that's being written if you're outsourcing that. And if you're completely outsourcing it and another company is going to take care of your automation, I think that would be a different discussion, because then you need to make sure that you bridge the gap between what's being developed in-house and what needs to be tested. So it really depends on your particular situation. But I've seen many companies outsource their automation needs. But what I've seen work best for companies is when you get help with speeding up or ramping up your automation, but at the same time, training your in-house QAs or automation engineers within your company to be able to test, learn how that particular framework works, and just basically continue maintaining that framework. One thing that I've seen work for many companies is, even if you're having your framework written by some other companies, I think it's very valuable to go through that framework creation process yourself, even if it's as a practice. It gives you invaluable insight to understand how things work in that framework and to be able to basically optimize it later on as you learn more and more about automation and how that particular framework works.
Thank you. Mandana, here is your next question. Is application under test important in deciding the framework? I believe yes.
That's true. It is important, but at the same time, your framework should be independent of the application under test. So you should be able to support multiple applications with any given framework. I do understand that there are some argument regarding the technology used in the application, but I do believe that for a particular application, there are certain frameworks that work better. But again, depending on the number of resources you have, you might decide to have one framework that supports multiple applications. You might not have the luxury of having multiple framework, for instance, that is being supported in-house by different teams. So it is important, but your framework and your solution should be application independent.
Then just to add on the same question, given all the time and resources and money, would you suggest it to be the framework to be specific to application if we did have the luxury to have it, or would you still think that the best way to do it is have it application independent?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I quite got.
For the application under test, like you mentioned that we may not have the luxury to have different frameworks for different applications. So we should build a framework which could be used for multiple applications, right? So my question here is, but given the resources, like if you did have all the money and all the time and all the resources, would it be best to build a framework for every application, or would you still think that we should build a framework that can be used across applications?
Depending on the application, if there are no technology challenges with that particular framework and the application under test, then I think a single framework can support multiple applications easily. But there are times that you have to integrate so many different things in that framework that you have just to support one application that doesn't really play well with the rest of your framework, then in that case, I think it's important to think about having a separate framework for that particular application. But if there are no technology challenges, then I'd say, a single framework is a way to go, because it's easier to maintain one framework than multiple framework if you don't have the resources. But again, in this case, you've mentioned that you not thinking about the constraint on the resources. So I'd say if there are technology challenges within that one framework, then think about creating a framework or picking a framework that is well suited for that particular application under test.
Great. Yeah, I thoroughly agree with that part. Yes. Your next question here is, Mandana, do you have a recommended approach for starting automation? For example, automating existing manual tests versus modeling the application and designing a new set of flexible automated tests from scratch?
So that's a great question. I'd say the recommendation that I have is start with the most valuable test. Look at your application and see what are the critical paths within an application. And if you have tests for those, automate those. If you don't, write tests and automate those first, because you don't want to just automate for the sake of automation. You want to automate so that you can bring value. If you were to create 5 tests for that application that you can run as soon as you have a deployment to determine if anything, or if you feel good about that particular build, automate those first. So unfortunately, most companies have so many manual tests, but just starting for whatever existing manual test you have, I don't recommend starting with those for automation, because you want to start with something, like I said, again, that brings value to you and your development team. Focus on the things that will give quick feedback to your development team. If there are other tests that you would like to automate, for instance, if there are setup tests, focus on those. Yeah, so that would be my recommendation.
Okay. The next question is, my company wants to use automation to build testing at the moment the programs are built. What are your thoughts on starting a continuous integration and delivery model with automation?
This is one of the greatest value, I think, of automation. I think, collaborating with your developers, just sitting with them and automating as they're developing will make your cycles faster. It will help determine if there are any defects, or if there are questions or ambiguity within the development process in itself. So I think this is exactly where we want to introduce automation. So I think it's a great way to introduce automation in your company.
Excellent. So here's a quick question. When you came into Discount Tire Company, did they have an existing automation framework, or did you design one from ground up?
Yes. So when I joined Discount Tire over 6 years ago, the company already had a automation framework in place for existing application. It was a very robust framework, well written, and it used basically Discount Tire used a commercial tool at that point. But ever since we introduced other framework, we used open source tool, and we have expanded our framework for different applications. We are lucky our management team supports automation, and they're committed to having more and more automation in our development cycle. So.
Okay, here is your next question. Do you use automation for regression testing or replacing manual system testing?
I'd say both. We have regression suites also, but we are also focusing on supporting our existing effort or different projects and making sure that we can automate the testing for those projects so they go faster. So there is a lot of talk about automating regression, and you know, if you have automation regression in place, great. But I think if you're starting automation, again, focusing on what's the most valuable area that you can introduce automation is something that I recommend. For instance, if you have multiple projects that are in flight and you would like to have shorter cycles when testing, then focus on those. And if you have, you know, downtime in your automation, then you can focus on other tests such as regression tests and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, here is, so there are two questions here, Mandana, which I'm going to combine into one. First is, how do you, okay, the first, let me read out this one. For a company wishing to start automating, what skill sets and levels should the company be looking for when hiring QA resources, manual testing skills, or strong programming skills? So this is one question, asking for what skills you should be looking for when you're hiring QA resources. The other question, pretty similar to that, is, excuse me, when a tester is wanting to start his career into automation, how should he start? How should he go for that? So, like, if you could first tell us for the company and then for the tester.
Okay, so the first question, what skill set the company should focus on hiring? I think you know, automation, I want to say it's almost an art form because you need to know development, but you also need to know testing. You just don't want to write automated tests, you know, because some of these tests are, if you write automation without the knowledge of testing, I argue the value of those tests and, you know, the value that they bring to the team is not what you expect it to be. So I think if you would like to think about skill set, if you get automation or testers who like to learn or have some development background, then that'd be a perfect mix. If you have developers who are interested in analysis and testing, that's also a great way to find resources for automation. So it's a mixture of both, I'd say, both development skills and testing skills. And then to answer the answer to the second question, which was if you're a manual tester, how would you go about learning automation? I'd say start with the basics. Pick a programming language that you think it's easy, something that's easy or fundamentals of the programming language, learn those first, but at the same time, learn about the existing automation. If your company has automation program, start looking into or pairing up with your QA engineers, look at the test results, get the IDE installed on your machine, try to look through the code, and then I'd say, like anything else, this is just practice. If you practice, if you look at it more and more, and you will learn it ultimately. But again, pick a programming language that you think you might like and start learning the fundamental and understand the existing framework that your company has. I think, like I said, the challenge in nowadays, especially in trying to convert manual testers into automation engineers, would be how this shift or how this change is being introduced. At the same time, I think companies need to be extremely vigilant, and they should focus on not creating that confusion, because it's not all about development and it's not all about testing. It's a mixture of both. So you want to learn the fundamentals first. And there are so many great trainings and programs online. There are free programs if you just Google it. If there are sites that you can learn about automation, and so I'd recommend just starting basically.
I strongly agree with that. Having a mixed skill set of programming languages and development skills and testing skills does make you more relevant and reliable automation tester.
True.
Okay, here is your next question, Mandana. What advice can you give us regarding selection for what test cases should be done in a functional way and what should be done, what should be automated?
Okay, so I'd say for your functional, and I'm assuming functional UI test you're talking about. So this is a very tricky thing. You want to have automated tests, but you don't want to automate everything through UI. It's great to look at your unit test or to pair up with your development team to see where those unit tests are and what they are testing, and then decide on the UI test and basically pick up where they left off. And you might look at some of these functional UI tests. There are navigation tests, there are particular transaction creation tests that your particular application might have. So introduce the ones or enough to know you test your application through UI, but don't forget to add other types of testing. You might want to introduce service testing. You might want to introduce visual testings. I think it is important to think about all different kinds of testing when it comes to automation. But for your functional UI test, focus on ways your business make money, the way it's important for your business, the particular or the critical path for your particular application.
Excellent, Mandana. We have questions and queries pouring in still, but in the interest of time, I'm going to probably not ask you them online right now, and we'll send you the questions of all the, especially the ones which have not been answered so far, and you can respond us. And attendees, once she responds back, we will post them up on the site along with the recording, so you can actually see your responses.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Smita. So I'm making you the presenter again.
Yes, I did that. So, okay. Yeah, thank you, Mandana. Actually, it was a very insightful session on where we could start with automation, especially the processes and frameworks and the basic fundamentals. I'm sure our attendees found it very informative and useful too. So thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. All right, everyone. This concludes our webinar for today. So thank you for joining, and more importantly, thank you for asking so many questions and being engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and for the whole group. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week ahead. See you all in Virginia in 2018. Happy learning always.